Wow, they sound really optimistic. They're gonna what? March right up the ancient road and win the day. Huh? Yeah. Huh? Just like Hannibal. Wait, what? No, yeah, you might want to rethink that. Or they might. Trust me. Okay. October 15th, 1943. The campaign is in full swing, and it's been gaining steady ground. The leaders all say that this is just a walk in the park, and within weeks, they'll then have the big prize. We've heard that a lot in this war, and an awful lot of times it turns out to be very much untrue. That happens again this week. I'm Indy Neidell. This is World War II. Last week in Italy, the Allies advanced beyond Naples to the Volturno River. They also advanced in New Guinea, and while in the USSR it wasn't a big advance, they did secure and expand a number of bridgeheads on the Dnieper River and finish the liberation of the Kuban. Something new that the Allies begin this week happens in the Solomon Islands. It's an aerial bombing campaign against the main Japanese base at Rabaul, New Britain. See, the Allies' next phase of attacks up the Solomons involves landings at Bougainville, planned to begin November 1st. George Kenney, Allied Air Force's commander here, figures if the 5th Air Force can do some damage at Rabaul before that, it would really help keep the enemy off the backs of the air units in the Solomons during the landings, since they are and will continue getting closer to Rabaul than 5th Air Force is, which is on New Guinea. Now, Bougainville itself is the largest of the Solomons, and the Allies know this is one island in their island hopping plan that cannot be hopped over, and is going to have to be fought for, and it won't be easy. They estimate that there are 35,000 of the enemy there. There are also 2 active volcanoes among the many peaks covered in jungle. The beaches are narrow, certainly not suitable for assaults, and the Japanese have 6 airfields there, 4 around Buin in the south and 2 more in the north at Buka and Bonin. The plan is for a month of steady bombing of Rabaul starting the 12th. On the 9th, aerial recon shows 270 Japanese planes there. Kenney is sending pretty much everything he has on the 12th. 214 bombers escorted by 125 P-38s, 339 planes in all. Surprise is total at both Rapopo and Vunakanu airfields. Heck, at Rapopo, the AA guns are still covered with canvas when the planes arrive. Of course, by the time planes arrive at smaller Tobera Field, and at the town of Rabaul itself and its harbor, the Japanese are on alert. But still, according to Mark Lardas in Rabaul 1943 and 44, up to 60 enemy planes are damaged or destroyed on the ground. 5 fighters shot down. There are heavy casualties among ground personnel, 2 fuel dumps are destroyed, 6 cargo ships sunk, and 7 warships damaged, in exchange for 5 planes lost. Kenney wants to continue attacking the next day, but bad weather prevents any more attacks for the rest of the week. There is also major Allied bombing in Europe this week. On the 14th comes a second bombing raid on Schweinfurt. This is also called Black Thursday by the attackers, so you know right there that it doesn't go well for someone, and it is an American raid on the German ball-bearing factories. This time, all of the planes go for Schweinfurt instead of being split among targets like the first raid was. 229 of 291 B-17s make it there. 60 of those are lost, 17 damaged so much they're junk. That's a loss of more than a quarter of the planes, and 121 more took at least some damage. It is only 22% of the crew that is lost, 650 men out of 2,900. So this is a huge failure. Thing is, Allied intelligence identified a bottleneck in German ball bearing production last year. So in the point-blank bombing directive issued in June, ball bearing factories are the number 2 overall target behind fighter planes, but ahead of everything else, including oil and petroleum products. British bomber commander Arthur Harris thinks this operation to be a fool's errand, and that hitting ball-bearing factories will not magically win the war. So he does not work with the Americans here. Turns out that though the 3 factories here do produce nearly half of Germany's production of ball bearings. Germany now has big reserves of them bought from Sweden and Switzerland to fix that production bottleneck, and also has a production surplus of their own by now, so the raid makes little difference. They do a lot of damage, sure, and production is stopped for 6 weeks or so, but the Germans already have all the ball bearings they need. 8th Air Force has lost 88 other planes this week as well in other actions, and this is not sustainable. So long-range daytime bombing runs are suspended after this until the bombers can be escorted by P-51 fighters. But that suspension does not affect the general tone of the war these days. Everywhere, Allied forces were on the march. In the Southwest Pacific, parallel thrusts in New Guinea and the Solomon Islands continued to pare away pieces of the Japanese Empire. The first B-29 bombers were coming off U.S. assembly lines, doubling the range of existing planes and putting Japan's home islands at risk. British and American bomber fleets from England were already pummeling German cities, though at a frightful cost in air crews. In the East, Hitler had already lost 500,000 dead and 2 million wounded. Goebbels told his diary, "We are still retreating and retreating." And of course, in Italy, with Naples secured, the Allies, especially Mark Clark, are just raring to go further. Overall Commander Dwight Eisenhower wires American Army Chief of Staff George Marshall that both he and Army Group Commander Harold Alexander think they'll have Rome by the end of October. Alexander figures Florence by December. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill thinks the Germans don't have the manpower to even make a real front. American President Franklin Roosevelt even writes to Joseph Stalin, "Looks like the Allies will be in Rome in just a few weeks." On the 13th, Italy even declares war on Germany. This is from the government seat at Brindisi. That same day, though, they all begin to discover that such optimism may be misplaced. See, 30 kilometers or so north of Naples is the Volturno River, and the 6 divisions of 5th Army will have to fight the 4 of Heinrich von Vietinghoff's German 10th Army to cross it. It is Lucian Truscott's 3rd Division that kicks off the fight for the Allies at 1 a.m. the 13th. Gunners flipped back their camouflage nets and let fly a barrage that strapped and howled across the dells. Artillery rippled like chain lightning down the Volturno Valley, shaming the full moon that silvered the river. Flames soon guttered from the German-held hills and farmhouses north of the river. More guns barked downstream from the 3 British divisions joining the assault, and upstream, where 2 other American divisions on Truscott's right, the 34th and 45th, anchored a 40-mile front. The Volturno is around 60 meters wide here and is fordable. Just before 2 a.m., phosphorus shells join the barrage to create a cloud cover under which the men begin to cross the river. On the left are the 46th, 56th, and 7th Armored Divisions from 10th Corps, but they make either little or no progress. The 3 divisions I mentioned in the quote are from 6th Corps, and they advance and make a crossing. It is a bloody crossing, but it is, by the next afternoon, a crossing on a broad front. What they have to face next is hills, and then higher hills. The Germans have also mined, sabotaged, or demolished everything. So the engineers are getting a real workout. Allied headquarters estimates they'll need 1,000 bridges to reach the Po River. They have 5 prefab ones at the moment. It's also getting colder and wetter, mainly wetter as there's a lot of rain just now, and rain turns unsurfaced roads to mud. There are exactly 4 surfaced northbound highways, 6, 7, 16, and 17, that can carry the traffic of an army. And as Alexander notes, all roads lead to Rome, but all roads are mined. 5th Army casualties from mines alone will reach as high as 40% of the total this fall. Of those 4 highways, only 2 actually lead to Rome. Highway 7, which was the Appian Way in Roman times, and that's a way better name than Highway 7, makes for Rome by the coast, between the sea and the mountains, before reaching what were the Pontine Marshes, but were drained by Mussolini a few years ago and are now open meadows. This is not an attractive route for the Allies. Here's a nice little piece of history about Highway 6. It threaded its way north through the mountains about 35 miles inland from the coast. Built by the Romans 2,500 years earlier, Highway 6 had been trodden by many marching soldiers, among them Roman legions striding to confront Hannibal in the 3rd century BC, and the French and Spanish armies disputing control of Italy in the 16th century. The latter clash was particularly fascinating to one scholarly German corps commander, Lieutenant General Fridolin von Zenger und Etterlin, because it had been played out near Cassino in what was now his sector of the German defenses. In the winter of 43-44, Zenger believed it would be the turn of the Allies to attempt to force a passage on that road. I'll talk a bit about those defense lines next week. As this week ends, the battle in the west has moved beyond the Volturno, but the Germans are expertly defending. In the center of the country, the Canadians from 8th Army take Campobasso and Vinciaturo. The Soviets are on the move as well. As I mentioned last week, by the 9th, the Kuban has been liberated. The German 17th Army has mostly escaped to Crimea, though. They are to join the German line south of Zaporozhe, but they end up stuck where they are when the Soviets attack Melitopol. This is on the 14th, and the Soviets also cut the railroad from Melitopol to Crimea. This is Fyodor Tolbuchin's southern front breaking the Molochnaya River line, right? The 9th and 10th, 19th Tank Corps gets into positions at their small bridgehead, and on the 10th, they drive forward, and 51st Army hammers its way to Melitopol. There is heavy fighting for the city the rest of the week.
Some 80 kilometers north of that, Rodion Malinovsky's southwestern front assault on the Zaporozhe bridgehead goes off now on the 10th after an artillery barrage. For 3 days, they slowly grind out some bloody gains, but Malinovsky and Ivan Konev from the steppe front don't think they'll be able to take it by the 15th as Stavka has ordered.
But there are developments the 13th on the German side. I talked last week about Siegfried Heinrici wanting to evacuate and even to blow the dam, and Hitler's orders to fight to the last man. Well, Heinrici's drawn up plans for withdrawal. In fact, he does withdraw to an inner defensive line closer to Zaporozhe by the 13th. Heinrici later wrote an account of the decisions he had to make prior to the evacuation of the bridgehead. Matters were complicated by the consequences of demolition of the dam. There was a fear this would create a large bulk of water rushing downstream into 6th Army's sector. For Heinrici, preparation of the river crossings for demolition and execution of his planned evacuation of the bridgehead, codenamed Doppelkopf, were inextricably linked. But he received permission from higher commands only for the former. Despite the numerous disasters that had befallen the Wehrmacht due to adherence to unworkable orders, obedience to higher command remained strong, and Heinrici asked again to be given authority to order the execution of Doppelkopf if necessary. First Panzer Army Headquarters says no, but time is really running out. So Heinrici asks its commander Eberhard von Mackensen personally, even saying he'll take the blame for any negative consequences. Mackensen says, "It's your neck that's on the block." Heinrici gives the orders. The next day, Mackensen says OKH has approved evacuation. The 16th Panzer Grenadier Division is the rear guard, and most of the other men will evacuate by night. On the 14th, though, the plans for blowing the dam are in jeopardy because of repeated Soviet air attacks. The plan is to blow it at 5 p.m., but there is still the rear guard on the east bank then, and Heinrici won't abandon them, so it's pushed back to 8 p.m. The railway bridge is blown just before 7, the 16th Panzer Grenadiers cross over the dam, and demolition begins at 8. It takes hours to blow all the segments of the dam. But the Germans have managed to cross with losses that could have been a whole lot heavier, and they've managed to prevent the Red Army from breaking into the bridgehead. However, any rest they thought they'd get and any well-prepared defenses they thought they'd arrive at are just fantasies, because the defenses are limited and the Red Army is not going to stop the pressure. The autumn rains that bring the mud, the Rasputitsa, have stopped armies the past couple of years who've waited until the ground freezes for winter assaults, but the Red Army is not to be stopped. The Dnieper can be fortified into a mighty defense line. They will not give the Germans time to do so. Their bridgehead at the Bukrin Bend has been basically screened off, but the big one south of Kremenchug has been reinforced and expanded, and the Germans will have to eliminate that to have a hope of holding the river line. If they can break out, it's indefensible. Konyev's plan for this is to break out at Mishuryn Rog and head for Kirovograd, roughly where German 8th Army meets 1st Panzer Army, then turn south and pin 1st Panzers down towards the river's mouth, perhaps even surrounding them. Such attacks had repeatedly shown there was a tendency for units to pull back towards their center of gravity. Consequently, Konev could expect units of 8th Army to pull back towards the northwest, while 1st Panzer Army would retreat towards the southwest. The gap that would open between the two would help the Red Army achieve further penetrations against the open flanks of both German armies. It also helps the Soviets that, much like Zaporozhe, Adolf Hitler has ordered Nikopol held at all costs. This actually does make a bit more sense than Zaporozhe did. Nikopol is a center for manganese mining, and manganese is needed for producing steel alloys, which the Germans need for armaments. They also have very few sources of it, so even though the Soviets have crossed the river in multiple places, and it is a crappy defense line now, Hitler is adamant that they hold Nikopol. The land south of it is also vital if they want to hold Crimea, and Hitler worries that Soviet bombers would wreck Romanian oil installations if they could operate from the west of the Crimea. Today on the 15th, Soviet 37th and 7th Guards armies launched their attacks from Mishuryn Rog. The terrain favors defense here, and they don't make much headway until units from Pavel Rotmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army enter the fray. The leading units then advance over 20 kilometers by nightfall. I mentioned the Bukharin bridgehead being screened off. That's kind of the case. On the 12th, Nikolai Vatutin's Voronezh front forces, with nearly 800 tanks, have a manpower advantage of 3-1 and armor 6-1, but that's deceptive. The Germans have great defensive terrain, and their constant aerial and artillery attacks, as well as the mighty river itself, make it a nightmare to bring men and machines across. Vatutin calls off the attempts today. The first big attempt to break out of the Lyutezh bridgehead north of Kiev also comes this week on the 11th. The Soviets have again the advantage in men and armor, and the attack does open a gap in the enemy's lines, and it threatens the Kiev-Korosten railway, but the attack is on a narrow front, and the attackers cannot widen the breach. The fighting lasts the rest of the week, and the bridgehead grows stronger, but they cannot break out. And amidst all the fighting, the week comes to its end. The Zaporozhe crossing has fallen to the Soviets, which threatens to unhinge the German defenses. The Allies have crossed the Volturno River, but have realized that winning in Italy will be a lot tougher than they all thought. And Allied air power begins an offensive to soften up the enemy at Rabaul. It's funny that we see this yet again. Oh, this battle will be easy. This campaign will be a piece of cake. We've heard it from all leaders on all sides at this point. We're still hearing it, and it is so often untrue. Oh, sure, sometimes there are routes, yeah, and sometimes they are predicted. But at least a few, if not a few thousand, men die on the attacker's side anyway. Tell you what, you write to the parents of one of them and say, "The battle was a piece of cake. We walked all over the enemy. Oh, by the way, your son was killed in action." I don't think the family will agree that it was a piece of cake. But it is a piece of cake to join the Time Ghost army, and then you will be a part of this series, for it is the army that finances it. Yep, like this week's Army Member of the Week, Eric Kittlesby, or these new commissioned officers, they're part of this, and you can be too at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. Something else that's part of this, as we saw this week, is a lot of aerial bombing. Here is a War Against Humanity episode about the bombing of Hamburg. That series, which is both dark but necessary, is a companion piece to this one. See you next time.